They tried to silence a loyal dog, declaring his bark a crime against the neighborhood. The HOA's threats grew louder, but so did the storm building in the heart of the man they challenged. What followed was not just resistance. It was an unforgettable reckoning with a pack that no one saw coming. Before the battle begins, like this video and comment where you're watching from. The shouting started with no warning, the kind of shouting that cuts through bone. The HOA stood in the yard with papers waving in the air, spitting words like fines, violations, lawsuits. They said the sound of a dog's bark had no place here. They wanted silence, control, obedience. But the man didn't flinch. His jaw locked, his eyes narrowed, and his hand rested gently on the dog's back as if to say not today, not ever. Karen's voice rose above the rest, sharp and venomous, declaring that the dog would either be silenced or removed. She mocked loyalty as if it were a disease, sneering that neighbors deserved peace more than one man deserved companionship. The crowd behind her nodded, some reluctantly, others gleefully, feeding off her rage. But in that moment, the man's silence was louder than their threats. He simply turned, his lips curling into a half-smile that chilled Karen to the bone. No argument, no defense, just the quiet promise of a storm coming. Because they didn't know who they had pushed. They didn't know what lines they had crossed. The dog's bark was not just noise. It was memory. It was survival. It was proof that life had been saved once before by that sound. To ask him to end it was to ask him to bury his past and betray his future. That was never going to happen. The HOA scribbled down notes, threatening deadlines and punishments. They laughed as if victory was already theirs. But beneath that surface calm, something else was building. A plan. A retaliation. A response so sharp it would cut deeper than their paper rules ever could. And for the first time in their reign of fear, Karen's certainty wavered, because in the man's eyes was a warning she couldn't erase. At night, while the neighborhood lights dimmed, he made calls. Old voices answered, voices he hadn't heard in years, voices that carried the weight of loyalty and discipline. They didn't ask why. They already knew. When loyalty is threatened, when a bond is mocked, the response is simple. You gather your brothers, your sisters, and you remind the world that loyalty barks louder than tyranny. He remembered the day his dog pulled him out from the wreckage, teeth tearing into his seatbelt, dragging him to breath and life when smoke choked the air. That bark had brought rescuers running, had brought light into the darkest hour. And now they wanted that bark gone. That was not a rule. That was an attack. And attacks have consequences. The calls ended with a promise. Vehicles would roll in. Boots would hit the ground. Dogs would stand where fear once ruled. The HOA thought they had power, but they were about to learn the difference between authority written on paper and authority that stands on four legs, teeth bared, ready to defend. By morning, the HOA prepared another strike, another meeting, another chance to break a man's spirit. But behind closed doors, he was ready. He wasn't bringing one bark. He was bringing many. And each bark carried years of training, discipline, and unshakable loyalty. The sound of justice, the sound of reckoning, the sound no fine could ever silence. The neighbors would soon hear it, not as a nuisance, but as a chorus. A warning that power built on threats collapses when faced with those who stand unafraid. The HOA thought they had silenced one dog. Instead, they had awakened a pack. And when that pack arrived, Karen's hose, her papers, her threats would mean nothing. Because water dries, ink fades, but the sound of loyalty shakes the ground. That was the truth waiting outside her door, growing louder with each passing second. What would you have done if they tried to erase the only sound that once saved your life? Tell me in the comments, because this isn't just a story about a dog. It's a story about loyalty, justice, and what happens when control finally meets resistance. Stay with this, because the next moment will change everything. The next morning, Karen stormed across the yard with her board members trailing like shadows. She had new threats, heavier fines, louder demands. She screamed that the dog was already on borrowed time, that silence was the only option left. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains, drawn by the noise, waiting to see if the man would finally bend. But bending wasn't in his blood. Instead of breaking, he laughed. Not the laugh of someone who'd given up, but the laugh of someone who knew something no one else did. It rattled Karen more than any argument could. She doubled down, swearing she would take it to court, that she would bury him in paperwork until his loyalty became too expensive to keep. But every word she threw was wasted, because the man had already chosen his response, and it wasn't silence. Behind closed doors, he prepared. Old numbers filled his phone screen, names that carried history. Brothers, sisters, handlers, comrades. Each call wasn't a request, it was a reminder. Loyalty is never retired. It doesn't expire. It waits quietly until it's called. And when it's called, it comes with teeth. They didn't ask for details. They didn't need to. The moment they heard the HOA had tried to silence a dog, they were in. Because everyone in that circle knew what it meant when someone tried to erase loyalty. They knew the sound of a bark was never just noise. It was warning. It was life. It was the voice of trust. Karen had mocked the wrong thing, and that mistake was about to echo across every yard in the neighborhood. While the HOA whispered about fines, trucks were already loading. While Karen drafted threats, boots were being laced. While neighbors wondered if the man would surrender, he was preparing to unleash something they couldn't even imagine. This wasn't a fight over noise. This was a fight over respect. And respect, once broken, doesn't mend with signatures and seals. It mends with action. The man looked at his dog and remembered the night that bark had carried through smoke and fire, guiding rescuers to a heartbeat that should have been gone. That memory wasn't just a story, it was armor. And every time Karen shouted that barking was a crime, she sharpened the blade of his resolve. By sundown, the plan was locked. Karen thought she had cornered him with rules and penalties. She had no idea he had cornered her with patience and silence. What she called control was about to be exposed as weakness. What she thought was power was about to collapse under the weight of loyalty arriving in numbers. The first headlights cut through the night like promises. Dark silhouettes stepped out, handlers with leashes in hand, voices steady, eyes unshaken. And with them came the sound, low, rumbling growls that grew into the kind of barks that carried history. Each bark was a vow, a declaration that loyalty had returned to the battlefield. The neighborhood froze, caught between fear and fascination. Was this real? Was this actually happening? Karen's smirk cracked for the first time. She stuttered, muttering about trespassing and violations, but her voice wavered under the chorus of K9's answering back. For years, she had ruled with rules. Now she faced a force that couldn't be fined, couldn't be silenced, couldn't be controlled. Each bark grew louder, each step closer, until the air itself seemed to shake. The HOA didn't realize it yet, but the balance of power had already shifted, because loyalty had arrived. And loyalty doesn't knock. It doesn't ask permission. It enters with authority and waits for no one. Karen's papers would soon mean nothing. The dogs were here. The handlers were here. And the man who once stood alone now stood with a pack. If you've ever had someone try to break what matters most to you, you know this feeling. Tell me in the comments what you would do in his place, because the next move in this story is not just resistance, it's retaliation. Stay, because the next moment will turn Karen's threats into her nightmare. By morning, the HOA gathered again, convinced the night had changed nothing. Karen marched at the front, armed with a new list of demands and a smug certainty that fear would do her work. She raised her voice, declaring the dog's days numbered, threatening fines that stacked higher than rooftops, daring the man to defy her one more time. But before her echo could fade, the sound that cut through the air wasn't silence. It was the chorus of K9's. A deep, rolling bark that started low and swelled until every board member's confidence cracked. Heads turned as the pack emerged, leashes taut, muscles rippling, handlers walking with measured steps, each dog ready, each bark sharpened like steel. Karen's laughter sputtered into stammering denial. She called it intimidation, she screamed violation, but the crowd wasn't laughing with her. Neighbors stepped out, eyes wide, phones lifted, capturing a moment they would never forget. Karen had wanted silence. Instead, she was met with an army of voices louder than anything she could write down. The man stepped forward at last. No shouting, no flailing. Just calm authority in a black shirt stamped with bold yellow letters. K9 unit. He didn't need to speak. The pack did it for him. Every growl was a warning. Every bark a reminder that loyalty couldn't be caged. Karen's rage boiled. Desperate to reclaim control, she snatched a hose, blasting water across the lawn, drenching the dogs, trying to mock them with laughter that shook under the weight of her own panic. The spray hit hard, but the K9s didn't retreat. They barked louder, snapping jaws toward the stream, teeth flashing, eyes locked on her as if daring her to keep going. The crowd gasped, half in fear, half in awe. This wasn't a standoff anymore. This was a reckoning. Every drop of water Karen sprayed only fueled the storm against her. The dogs weren't backing down, and neither was the man standing behind them, his smirk steady, his stance unshaken. Karen shouted for someone to stop him, demanded neighbors step in, but no one moved. Instead, whispers spread that the HOA might not be untouchable after all. For the first time, the fear shifted away from the man and onto Karen. The same people who had once nodded behind her now stood still, caught in the pull of loyalty stronger than her threats. Then the twist struck. Sirens echoed in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. Karen's face lit with triumph as she screamed that law was on her side. She shouted that he was finished, that the dogs would be dragged away and the man charged. She raised her arm in victory as the cruiser rolled in. But when the officer stepped out, the energy changed. His eyes scanned the scene, lingering on the man in the black shirt, then on the pack standing firm. Recognition flashed. Authority shifted. He didn't speak to Karen first. He walked toward the man. Karen's face drained of color. Her plan was unraveling before she could understand why. The officer looked at Karen only after greeting the man with the faintest nod, the kind of nod that spoke of history, of battles fought together, of debts that couldn't be erased by paper rules. Karen opened her mouth to demand arrests, but the officer's silence weighed heavier than her screams. And then, in one swift moment, the crowd realized what Karen didn't. The power was no longer hers. It never had been. The leash of control had snapped, and the sound of K9's barking was now the law that mattered. If you think this is where Karen finally meets her karma, drop a heart in the comments so I know you're still with me. Because the next move from that officer didn't just break Karen's plan, it broke her empire. And you're not ready for what happens next. The officer's silence stretched like a blade, cutting deeper than any of Karen's screams. She demanded his attention, waving her papers, shouting about bylaws and violations. But his eyes never left the man in the black shirt. Then came the twist she never expected. The officer called him by name, a name spoken with respect, the kind of respect built through sweat, scars, and battles that Karen's clipboard could never comprehend. Karen froze, the hose slipping slightly in her grip as she realized the officer didn't see her as authority. He saw her as noise. Her voice cracked as she tried again, insisting this was her neighborhood, her rules. But the officer's hand shifted to his belt, not as a threat to the dogs, but as a warning to her. Authority had switched sides in an instant, and everyone could feel it. The man finally stepped closer, calm as ever, the K9s forming a wall between him and chaos. Karen lashed out, accusing him of staging intimidation, calling him reckless, unfit, dangerous. But her words sounded smaller now, drowned out by the synchronized barks echoing behind him. Every bark was a hammer driving nails into her crumbling confidence. The officer raised his voice at last, not to the man, but to Karen. He demanded she put down the hose, to stop provoking the dogs, to stop escalating a fight she had already lost. The crowd gasped. For the first time in years, Karen wasn't the one commanding. She was being commanded. Her face flushed red, her hands shook, yet she refused to yield. She screamed that she ran this neighborhood, that the HOA was her empire. She accused the officer of bias, corruption, betrayal. But her voice cracked with every sentence, her desperation spilling into every word. The man didn't need to reply. The officer did it for him, warning her that harassment carries consequences heavier than any bark. Karen, cornered, made a mistake. She turned the hose back toward the K9s, unleashing a stream of water as if that could wash away her defeat. The dogs barked louder, lunging forward with teeth bared, restrained only by their handler's steady grip. The crowd erupted, half cheering, half gasping, as the image of Karen drenched in her own rage became the symbol of her downfall. One of her own board members finally cracked, stepping away from her side, muttering loud enough for everyone to hear that she had taken things too far. Betrayal struck her like lightning. Her mouth fell open, unable to comprehend that the people she thought she controlled were turning against her. One by one, whispers grew. Some backed away, others crossed their arms, no longer nodding along to her tantrums. The officer leaned in, his voice sharp, telling her she was the one breaking laws now. Harassment, endangerment, abuse of authority. Karen tried to shout over him, but the sound of barking drowned her out, her voice reduced to nothing more than static against thunder. And just when she thought she could recover, the officer reached for his radio. Karen's eyes widened. She stumbled back, clutching her papers like a shield, demanding to know what he was doing. But everyone already knew. That radio wasn't for the man. It wasn't for the dogs. It was for her. If you're still watching and waiting for her downfall, hit the like button so this moment of karma can spread. Because the next sound from that radio wasn't just a call for backup. It was the end of Karen's reign. And what happens when the law turns on its queen? That's what comes next. Karen's grip on power slipped with every second the officer's radio hissed. She tried to shout louder, to claw back control, but the board members behind her had already begun exchanging uneasy glances. One of them finally stepped forward, shaking his head, admitting that Karen had forged signatures on complaints, that her fines were lies stacked on lies. The crowd gasped, the betrayal cutting deeper than any bark. Karen spun on him, eyes wild, calling him a coward, a traitor. But another voice rose, this time a woman from the board who admitted she'd been pressured, bullied, threatened into signing documents she didn't believe in. Her voice cracked with guilt, and the neighbors, once silent, erupted into murmurs. Karen's empire wasn't cracking, it was collapsing. The man in the black shirt didn't move. He didn't need to. The K9s barked with each confession, their voices matching the rhythm of Karen's downfall. Each bark made her flinch. Each bark reminded her that intimidation could be repaid in kind. Her hose hung limp in her hands now, the water nothing more than mist in the air, powerless against the storm she had created. Desperate, she tried to rally what remained of her allies. She turned to the others, begging them to stand with her, promising she'd protect them if they kept their loyalty. But no one stepped forward. Instead, one man shouted from the crowd that the HOA had drained his savings over petty violations, that Karen had ruined his family. Another neighbor raised her voice, saying she had been fined for flowers planted in the wrong color pot. Story after story poured out, each one a dagger through Karen's carefully built throne. The officer listened, his hand still firm on the radio, his eyes hard as steel. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. Karen was destroying herself with every word spoken against her. Her shrieks grew higher, her face red with fury, screaming that they were ungrateful, that without her rules this neighborhood would fall apart. But the truth was already exposed. Her rules were the rot, her power the disease. The man's smirk widened, but still he stayed silent. The silence cut sharper than anything else, letting Karen drown in the echoes of her betrayal. She realized too late that she wasn't facing just one man and his dog anymore. She was facing an army of loyalty, an army of neighbors who had finally had enough. In her desperation, Karen made her boldest threat yet. She swore she would sue the K9 handlers, the officer, the neighbors, anyone who dared to oppose her. She ranted about lawyers and endless money, promising she would drag them all through years of battles they couldn't afford. She clung to her paperwork like armor, her voice breaking under the weight of her own madness. But then came the twist. One of the neighbors, a quiet man who had stood in the back, stepped forward holding a folder. Inside were documents, records, proof of Karen's forged complaints and fabricated violations. He revealed that he had kept copies for months, waiting for the right moment. The right moment had come. Karen lunged at him, snatching at the papers, but the officer stepped between them. He seized the folder, his face grim, his voice low but booming as he said this wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. This was criminal. The crowd roared, some with cheers, some with gasps. Karen staggered back, the hose finally slipping from her hands, the water hissing uselessly against the ground. Her empire was gone, shattered not by one dog's bark, but by the pack of truth unleashed around her. Yet still, her eyes burned with a dangerous fire. She wasn't finished. Not yet. Because even cornered, even stripped of allies, Karen wasn't going down quietly. She raised her chin, dripping with water and rage, and swore that if she was falling, she'd drag everyone else down with her. And that vow set the stage for the final clash. Because the next move she made wasn't just desperate, it was deadly. If you're still here, Comment justice so I know you stand on the right side. Because the storm that comes next will decide everything. Karen's vow to drag everyone down ignited fear, but it also lit the fire of resistance brighter than ever. Within days, summons were delivered, but not to the man, not to the officer, not to the neighbors. They were delivered to Karen. Her empire of rules had become a prison of evidence, and now every lie, every forged complaint, every abuse of power was stacked against her in black and white. The courtroom was not her stage. The confidence she carried on lawns and in board meetings faltered when the evidence spoke louder than her voice. The neighbors who once kept their heads down now stood up one by one, their testimonies cutting her deeper than any bark or growl. They told stories of harassment, of intimidation, of families broken by her greed. Each confession was a hammer striking the coffin she had built for herself. She tried to fight, interrupting with shrieks about loyalty and order, but the judge silenced her with the gavel, his eyes narrowed in disdain. Her words had ruled over lawns, but here they were nothing more than desperate gasps, the cries of a queen stripped of her crown. She had spent years punishing barks, but now the echoes of truth barked back at her in ways she couldn't silence. The man sat still, his K9s waiting outside, their presence lingering in every whispered memory. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The power wasn't in taunts, it was in patience. Karen's empire was being dismantled not by fists or fury, but by truth and loyalty. And loyalty has no leash. But just when it seemed over, Karen made her most desperate move yet. She pulled from her bag a stack of new accusations, wild claims against the officer, the neighbors, even the man himself. She called him violent, unstable, dangerous, unfit to live among decent people. She screamed that the K9s were weapons, that they were tools of intimidation, that the man had poisoned the neighborhood with fear. Her voice cracked, but her desperation gave her strength enough to spew venom one last time. The courtroom erupted in gasps, some shocked, some angered. But then came the twist. A video surfaced, played for all to see, captured by a neighbor's phone. Karen's own actions, caught in perfect clarity, her spraying the hose at barking K9s, her shouting threats, her mocking laughter, her threats to ruin lives. Every word, every movement, her downfall broadcast in the very evidence she thought no one would dare hold. She staggered back as the footage rolled, her face draining of color, her empire collapsing in real time. The judge leaned forward, his words final, declaring that her actions had crossed from petty violations to criminal harassment. The silence in the room was heavier than her shrieks, heavier than her fury. Karen collapsed into her chair, clutching papers that now meant nothing. Around her, the neighbors exhaled, tears welling in some eyes, relief flooding others. Years of oppression ended not with fireworks, but with the sound of her name read aloud as guilty. Guilty of forgery, guilty of harassment, guilty of abuse of power. The man closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, the weight on his shoulders lifted. His dog's bark, once branded a nuisance, was now a symbol of justice. A sound they had tried to erase became the sound that brought truth crashing down on the head of tyranny. If you've ever felt the satisfaction of justice landing right where it belongs, hit like and share this moment so more people know that karma doesn't miss. Because even now, as Karen sat broken, there was one last chapter waiting. She wasn't finished, and neither was loyalty. The final move would decide everything. Stay, because the ending will shake you harder than everything before. The verdict should have ended it, but Karen's pride wouldn't let her fall quietly. As the gavel struck, she leapt to her feet, her voice cracking with rage, shouting that this was corruption, that she had been framed, that loyalty itself was a crime. Her body shook with fury, her eyes wild, and she swore that no matter what papers they stamped, she would return, she would rise again. The officer moved forward, but it wasn't his steps that silenced her. It was the sudden echo of barks from outside the courthouse. The pack was waiting, their voices rising in unison, a chorus of loyalty that filled the silence Karen had once tried to enforce. The sound stopped her cold, her chest heaving as her empire crumbled not just in law but in spirit. The man walked past her without a glance, his calm steady, his presence unshaken. She spat venom at his back, vowing to ruin him with appeals and threats. But this time, no one listened. Even her own allies turned away, refusing to meet her eyes, ashamed of ever standing at her side. Betrayal surrounded her, and the crown she clutched so desperately slipped through her fingers. Outside, the K9s waited, tails stiff, eyes bright, their barks fierce but disciplined. Neighbors gathered, some with tears of relief, some with cheers of victory. The man placed a hand on his dog's head, the same dog Karen had sworn to silence, and whispered something only the dog needed to hear. That bond, stronger than any rule or law, had carried him through a war in his past and through this war at home. Karen stumbled out of the courthouse, her voice weaker now, drowned by the sounds of loyalty ringing in every bark. Reporters swarmed her, cameras flashing, capturing her collapse for the world to see. She shoved them away, screaming that she was the victim, but every image, every clip, only exposed her as the tyrant who had finally met her fall. The officer gave the final order. She was placed in handcuffs, her reign finished, her empire shattered. The crowd erupted, the moment not just justice but release. Years of oppression washed away in that single act, and the sound of the cuffs clicking closed was sweeter than any verdict. The man knelt, pulling his dog close, burying his face against loyal fur. The crowd quieted, watching the most powerful scene of all, not revenge, not rage, but love. The same bark Karen had tried to erase had once saved his life, and now it had saved an entire neighborhood. His voice broke as he promised the dog he would never let anyone silence what mattered again. The neighbors, once divided, stepped forward. Some patted the dogs, some hugged each other, some stood in silence, knowing they had just witnessed something that would be remembered forever. This wasn't just about barking. This was about freedom, about loyalty, about standing against abuse no matter the cost. And as the sun set, Karen was led away, her screams swallowed by the sound of K9s barking proudly. The sound of justice carried on 4 legs and one unshakable bond. If this story touched you, hit like so more people can see the power of loyalty. Share it with someone who needs to hear that justice still wins. And tell me in the comments what you would have done if it was your dog, your loyalty, your fight. Because stories like this aren't just entertainment. They're a reminder that no matter how loud corruption screams, truth will always bark louder.